Today, we are joined by Dr. Luca Valle. Dr. Valle graduated summa cum laude from Accidental College in 2010 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in biology. After college, he traveled to Indonesia as a Fulbright scholar, where he engaged in grassroots English education efforts on the island of Sulawesi. He then went on to earn his medical degree from Dartmouth Medical School, where he was awarded the S. Marsh Tenney Research Award for his contributions to cancer research. During medical school, he also had the opportunity to participate in a research fellowship at the National Institutes of Health, where he gained valuable experience in clinical and translational research methods in oncology. After finishing a medical internship year in Denver, Colorado, he completed his residency training in radiation oncology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Upon graduation, he received the Radiologic Society of North America's Roentgen Resident Research Award. Dr. Valle focuses on the treatment of genitourinary malignancies and is passionate about addressing pervasive disparities in cancer outcomes and increasing representation of underrepresented groups on clinical trials. We also have Yoli Origel. Who is known in her community as Yolanda, who is known as her community as Yoli, is the CEO and founder of Cancer Kinship, a Southern California-based nonprofit organization. She was diagnosed at the age of 31 with stage 3 triple-negative breast cancer. She is also a BRCA1 gene carrier. Yoli lost her mother and sister to metastatic disease when they were both 42 years old. Yoli has served as a patient mentor for newly diagnosed cancer patients at her cancer center. Yoli's extensive professional nonprofit experience spans more than 25 years. Her accomplishments include developing and launching Cancer Kinship in 2018 and developing 4 core programs that transitioned virtually to meet the growing needs of the cancer community amid the pandemic. Since then, Cancer Kinship expanded internationally with a focus on vulnerable populations in Southern California. Yoli has been trusted co-chair of the Orange County Cancer Coalition, who led more than 15 cancer-serving nonprofits through the pandemic with strategic planning, resource sharing, and collaboration efforts. She is a successful resource development expert who believes in the power of storytelling and community partnerships to raise awareness and much-needed resources for local cancer warriors. We also have Dr. Eunice Wong. Dr. Eunice Wong is a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation. Her research broadly focuses on mental health disparities and mental health services in community and military settings. Much of her research has involved trauma-exposed populations and underserved communities. Dr. Wong earned her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we also have Dr. Hayo K. Park. Dr. Park is a gynecologic oncology specialist who is uniquely trained and experienced in offering both surgical and medical treatment for a wide breadth of gynecologic cancers and pelvic health issues. She is faculty at Providence St. John's Cancer Institute. She is deeply committed to empowering her patients and their loved ones through compassionate and individualized therapy and education. The goal of her work is not only to help her patients achieve better survival, but also to restore their hope and dignity. Dr. Park also serves as pelvic health specialist for the Audre Lorde Health Program at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. We invite you to enter any questions you have into the Q&A section, and we will get to as many as possible. But right now, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to ask a few questions of the panel, and this is going to be open to anybody who would like to answer it. First, we're going to start off, how does health equity become important for cancer patients receiving treatment? Anybody want to join in on that one?
I can hop in. Hi, everyone, Yoli. When I reflect back on my family's cancer story, my personal cancer story is actually bookended by my mom and my sister. My mom in the 80s, and then my sister when I was an 8-year cancer survivor. And just in one family alone, my family, there were significant disparities in the way our cancer was treated. My mother was an immigrant from Mexico, living in rural Central California, language barriers, many barriers. And she made medical decisions based on a 6-year-old's translation. And then you look at me living in Central or South Orange County, access to amazing cancer center, great insurance. Here I am alive 15 years later. And then fast forward my sister, she had developmental disabilities, dealing with domestic violence issues, things that we didn't know about until things came to light later, and she's no longer with us. So just in this family, being able to look at what was available linguistically, culturally to my family, what was available to those with social determinant issues like domestic violence, and how can we be better as a cancer serving community to break down those barriers and address the needs of our cancer community in as much real time as possible. I think that's super important.
Thank you so much, Yoli, and I do relate to the fact that being a 6-year-old interpreter, and I also wonder back, like, how correct were my interpretations, right? I mean, my parents, are still healthy, so I'm hoping I didn't make too many mistakes, but that is very important. The access to those language services being one of those components. Does anybody else want to add, how does health equity become an important part for cancer patients receiving treatment?
I can hop in as well. So, from the medical perspective, part of the reason I wanted to become a doctor and oncologist is because I wanted to sort of cure or help as many people as possible. And, when you first start out in your training, the focus is on, how can we improve the drugs? How can we improve the treatments? How can we take the best treatment that's available and make it even better? And so that was sort of the focus early on in my training, but then you come to realize that the best treatment that exists is not the treatment that's available to most patients. And so I think, at one point in my training, I realized that really the way to maximize impact as a physician and as a researcher is not necessarily to try to make incremental gains in the best treatment that we have available, but rather to increase the number of patients who have access to the best treatment available. And so to me, that's the core of health equity research, and that's why we're all here today. And I think that's what's most meaningful to a lot of the cancer patients I see and the cancer patients that we serve is, how can we reduce the barriers to accessing the outstanding care that we know is possible in the United States, but that quite frankly, a lot of patients simply can't access due to a number of complicated factors. But so to me, sort of the mission of improving outcomes and curing cancer and the mission of improving health equity are inexorably connected, and you can't do one without the other. So that's sort of my take on it.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Valle. Excellent point. Anybody else want to add to that conversation?
Yeah, I would definitely like to, piggyback off of both Yoli and Dr. Valle's point. I completely agree with Dr. Valle that oftentimes the challenge isn't, there's definitely disparities in clinical trial setting, as we kind of saw in the videos. And we definitely need to push those boundaries too. But, in a lot of underserved and minority communities, it really comes down to even just delivering standard of care in a timely fashion. So a lot of it, the work is done, with boots on the ground setting. How do we deliver standard of care and get these patients to adhere through these treatments, without loss of follow-up, without significant complications, especially because they generally do experience more, pre-existing comorbidities and other kind of psychosocial challenges to begin with. So as especially in the early part of my career, I was very focused on, looking more in not necessarily, trying to stay within the community and trying to deliver as much evidence-based and university level tertiary care in a community setting, rather than always, expecting the patients to find their way to me in kind of, large academic centers or tertiary care centers, unfortunately. So I definitely see the importance of that.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Park. Dr. Wong, would you like to add to that question as well?
speaking on the mental health side, because that's more my expertise, I think all of these barriers are issues and probably a lot of disparities around holistically caring for the person and all the mental health issues that come up with cancer care. And it's really important that they're getting the best cancer care, but also addressing the other types of needs that come along when you're experiencing cancer.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our next question. What do you all think are some of the more common barriers to achieving health equity in cancer care? And I know some of you brought up some now in terms of access to care, language, other social determinants, but what other barriers are you seeing that prevent us from achieving health equity?
I can leap in for this one as well. So, I mean, we've been hearing about this, all morning, but I think enrollment on clinical trials is key here. I think that's, a huge driver of the inequities. It's a symptom of inequity. And I think, it's something that I've become very interested recently and sort of pouring a lot of thought into, how we can better increase representation of underserved and underrepresented patient groups on clinical trials, because it's sort of a multifactorial, adverse effect if we're not enrolling patients who are underserved on trials, right? We lose the opportunity to offer them one of the best treatments potentially available, but perhaps more importantly, we're losing the opportunity to understand how these new cutting-edge treatments work and behave in these critical populations of patients. And so, there's a lot of questions about generalizability and, even asking research questions in the first place that matter to these communities, I think is sort of where this has to start. So, I think, as somebody who thinks a lot about clinical trials and is working on designing trials and things like that, I think community-based participatory research is where I'm trying to focus and to, with the overall objective of increasing representation of underserved groups on trials, because I think that's sort of fundamental to helping reduce inequities. And it's something that could spiral out into other potential advantages for all cancer patients.
Thank you for that. And I mean, clinical trial diversity is, that was my dissertation focus. It's the work I've been doing for 15 years. So that is definitely something that is near and dear to my heart. Any other barriers that the panelists think are preventing us from achieving health equity?
I'll hop in because I see this on a daily basis. And I really appreciate what Dr. Wong said about mental health and our patient or cancer survivors, patients' ability to cope with life. And then you throw cancer on top of that. I mean, it's very hard to be focused on health and to experience equity related to health when you have all these huge priority areas, crises happening all around. So whole person support is really important when we look at improving health outcomes for all. And trying to find ways in the best ways in which we can provide support from a holistic standpoint. Whole person support, I think, is definitely necessary.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And I think, when we have discussed the language barrier and the cultural competency issue already, but the language barrier issue, I think goes beyond just simply like understanding, what the physician is telling you and then communicating vice versa. I think it's especially for cancer care and achieving, not only cancer related, just cancer specific outcomes, but other, cancer and health related quality of life and really achieving that sense of wellness and then just beyond cancer on their way to, survivorship and healing. It's really important to, be a full participant in their care and developing a true therapeutic partnership with the providers. And that's very difficult to do when there is a cultural and a language barrier. They're less likely to advocate for themselves. They have a less in-depth understanding of their own disease. They're less likely to, disagree or ask, questions. Oftentimes, patients with language barriers from minority communities do kind of rely on their children, and maybe younger children or adult children, or even going through the translators. But when you have that kind of third party, you have to go through that third party. I almost feel that I can feel the patients kind of taking almost a passive role in their care, and that I think often is a barrier in really delivering care. So I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the patient has as full and a comprehensive understanding of their care plan as possible. I think it's just as important as what kind of treatment that they get.
I think when I think about everybody, what they've all shared, it's the heart of it is really meeting the patient where they're at, so they can access and fully engage in their treatment. And in my eyes, one of the biggest barriers are just with the way policies are set up and the associated funding mechanisms, right? So whether it's clinical trials and making sure there are diverse communities, like whatever the barriers are to participating in those trials, a lot of the policies and the fundings are sort of cut for a certain person who can take time off work and to participate in those trials, or having culturally competent providers. They're lucky if they have Dr. Park, but that's not the standard, right? Making sure that you have culturally competent providers, or the holistic care, making sure if they're struggling socioeconomically or housing, like all of those holistic care, like the funding and the policies aren't set up to address those issues so they can fully get the treatment that they need.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Wong. And you're absolutely right. And I know one of the strategies is to get more patients involved in the development of clinical trials, right? Because oftentimes they don't take that into account, the transportation barriers, the cost. I know with one little study I did, it was how much money was going into just recruitment, and recruitment's kind of like an afterthought when you have to take into account, we have to meet the needs of the patient. And we do need to improve the design of clinical trials so it involves the patient, so it's really made for them and it is patient-centered. So thank you. But you did mention, cultural competence. So I'm going to start with Dr. Valle. Dr. Valle, what training have you done, or do you recommend that other professionals in regard to health equity and cultural humility?
Yeah, so I mean, this is very important. Obviously, I've tried to educate myself about disparities that exist and the quality and character of them, because you can't tackle a problem if you don't understand it. And I think there's a couple of ways to approach this. There's sort of the experiential learning approach, and then there's sort of the academic learning. And I've been lucky to sort of be able to engage in both. So as mentioned in the introduction, after undergrad, I had the opportunity to live in Indonesia for a year, and I was teaching English in a remote fishing village. And that was my first sort of experience with like true significant healthcare inequities. And certainly became clear that disparities not only fueled by resource questions, but also due to sort of structural barriers that are imposed on communities by society that sort of perpetuate this inequity. And you can't sort of unsee that once you've seen that. So that sort of carried through my medical training. And as a medical student, I then sort of similarly had the chance to experientially learn about healthcare disparities, in particular by doing some of my rotations on my clerkships on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, working primarily with Alaska Native communities there. And certainly what I learned there, that there's different challenges and different components of disparity that apply into different settings. But also that, the inequity in our own backyard in the United States can be even more profound and staggering than inequity that you find abroad. And so I think if you have the opportunity to sort of get out and sort of spend time with a community that's not your own, particularly those who, have underserved needs or unmet needs, that's sort of one of the best ways to learn about what the needs are. You can certainly hear about them and sort of read about them, but experiencing them is one way do it. And then on the other side, academically, there's certainly literature emerging around healthcare inequities, and it's very different based on each specialty and each healthcare setting, certainly. So I guess I would just encourage folks who are interested in this to consult the literature and figure out what the unique challenges are for your particular niche. What have other people been thinking about? How do they approach it? How do they learn about this, deconstruct this? And I think that, it's sort of ultimately going to be a two-part educational experience to help, master or at least improve your own understanding of what health inequities look like in the communities you're serving, and how to approach that meaningfully and with humility.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Valle. You're absolutely right in that they go hand in hand, right? There's nothing like, going out into the community, volunteering your time, working with community-based organizations, community leaders. I mean, that, kind of experience and that kind of education, I think is definitely important when it comes to building that cultural humility and that cultural competence. And you're also at the same time building trust with communities, which is of utmost importance, right? So, I'm going to move now on to Yoli. For you, Yoli, what have you learned through your practice that has enabled you to see and hear your patient's situation in new ways?
So our organization, Cancer Kinship, has been around for 5 years. We're celebrating our 5th year anniversary, and we have 4 core programs that we offer. And one that comes to mind that is probably the most popular program right now is our free wig program called Kinner Beauty. And that program transitioned to us in 2021 from Susan G. Komen, and we rebranded, relaunched it. And in that relaunch, we established a free wig salon where people come in, get fitted for their wig. And it's almost like this captive audience that we have in the salon. And just like anybody, cancer or no cancer, when you go to the hair salon, you sit down in that chair, you open your heart to your hairdresser. They know probably more about your life than our friends and family. So in the salon, and this is what I call non-traditional support. In our salon, which, by the way, the consultations are done by cancer survivors. Cancer survivors who have lost their hair now have grown back. And that alone inspires hope. But having this captive audience in the salon, and then for the volunteers, even myself, I do a lot of the consultations, feeling confident enough to ask and probe, how are you doing? What's going on in your life since your diagnosis? How are you handling how's your mental health? What are some barriers? What are some challenges? How are you eating? How are you sleeping? In that conversation, in the hour-long wig consultation, so much is uncovered. And from that, we transition immediately into community resource navigation and identifying areas of priority, barriers that are preventing our cancer warriors from being emotionally sound or well, or barriers preventing them from getting to treatment or even access to a cancer center. Even I've had some that got a positive screening in a free mammogram program and then kind of didn't know what to do. And in that salon, they just know, I have cancer. I know I'm going to need a wig. I don't even know where I'm going to go get treated. And where the heck is this hospital? So in that salon, we're literally picking up the phone and doing resource navigation and partner referrals in real time. So that I love sharing that example because it truly is non-traditional. They're sitting in a salon vanity, having a heart-to-heart conversation with a survivor whom they trust immediately, and who has the wherewithal to even ask questions like, how are you doing? It can be that simple. So the resource navigation, though, that program is high touch. It requires a lot of follow-up. But the important aspect of the connections are the partnerships that our organization has developed year over year over year over year with other service provider, human services organizations. When I was developing the business plan for Cancer Kinship, I asked a lot of questions in nurse navigators, like, what are your biggest challenges, or what are you seeing as the biggest issues? And it wasn't so much that the capacity is always an issue, but it was, we don't have time to research the cancer or the human services organizations out there. The volume's too high. We keep sending them to the same organization. They're put on wait lists. We don't know who to send them to. So it's super important for me as a CEO of a nonprofit to get out there and get to know the other partners so we can refer back and forth to each other. And that happens with the Orange County Cancer Coalition a lot. And there's so much more that we can do to establish those partnerships that will provide whole person support to our cancer community.
Thank you for sharing that wonderful information and resources for cancer kinship. And yeah, there's something about that cape, right? That, you know, when the cape goes on, like your vulnerabilities go away, and you do tell a little bit too much to your hairdresser. I think sometimes you're right. She might know me a little too well, you know, in the 2 hours that I sit in her chair. But yeah, but it does feel like a relief. And that's why some of those beauty salon and barbershop programs work, right? Because you're using them as community leaders, and they have an impact and they have an influence on patients. And like, it's worked very well for screenings. And so it's a wonderful model. So I'm glad, you know, that it's definitely working in your organization. Now, Dr. Park, can you describe the psychosocial and physical impact of culturally competent care for women facing cancer?
Certainly, and I think it piggybacks off of this wonderful story that we heard. You know, women's cancer care is a very sensitive and very personal area. You know, of course, I specialize in gynecologic cancer, and you know, along with breast cancer, it is you know, a very deeply personal journey for the patient. So to be able to have a provider who can win your trust and be able to access those vulnerabilities for you, the patients to be able to share that throughout their, you know, diagnosis, treatment, and during recovery, I think really, you know, can positively impact their treatment and their recovery. So, you know, we have a lot of, you know, support. You know, I can't do this alone, of course. So we have a lot of support services from initial, you know, mental health and social support screening, getting them connected with our case managers and social workers, psychosocial counseling. We have a specific cancer support psychiatrist, and we do a lot of we try to promote a lot of activities and encourage patients to participate in activities that really continue to allow them to, you know, validate their, you know, womanhood, and, you know, continue to develop parts of themselves that they kind of look forward to. You know, keeping and carrying through after, you know, diagnosis. Cancer is one thing, you know, we'll beat it, but, you know, who's going to be there at the end of that journey? We don't want to lose yourself. And I think for women, that's kind of psychiatric, you know, psychological burden is very big. So to being cognizant of that and helping them along that journey can make a huge difference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park. And then on that note, Dr. Wong, I know Yoli kind of mentioned, you know, non-traditional practices, and, you know, working with a stylist, and, you know, Dr. Park also, you know, mentioned, you know, meeting the needs of our patients. So what are some examples, Dr. Wong, of partnering with faith-based communities to address health disparities? So other community leaders.
Yeah, so I actually have a line of work that is partnering with faith-based organizations. And part of that work, you caught me at a good time. I'm right in the middle of doing a literature review on faith-based and mental health sector partnerships. And so we, you know, gathered all the studies that focused on those types of partnerships. And we found like a lot of them were focused on mental health education, which makes sense. Like, these are places where a lot of people can get access to information, because I think that sometimes it's those simple things that can be barriers, just these social networks where there isn't a lot of information about just basic mental health information and where to get care. And the other thing that we found in this ongoing review was that there wasn't a lot of bi-directional referral. So when we think about like holistic care, a lot of it was like trying to get people in the faith-based and helping to refer them to the mental health sector, which is definitely important, but also having the mental health sector community recognize the importance of faith-based places and communities and relationships as part of their recovery process too. And so I can give you one example of my current project of a faith-based partnership. And this touches upon like the multi-sector. I think Yoli was talking about how it's so important to have like these multi-sector partnerships. So this current project I'm working on is a partnership between the Diocese of San Bernardino and NAMI. I'm not sure if you know, NAMI is the National Alliance Mental Illness, and they're the largest grassroots volunteer organization. And so it's bringing together these two, really, I see them as these like deployment, like you can think about a deployment approaches where you're already working with the strengths in the community. They've already, you know, developed their own programs, NAMI, that is the volunteer base. They know their community. And the faith-based organizations are a place where a lot of people turn to when they first have mental health issues. So it's bringing those two sectors together so that when issues come up, they can refer them to NAMI. And then NAMI also comes in to provide education. And then the hope is to infiltrate their social networks with these information resources, and then also to change social norms and stigma. So to change it at a congregational level and help create safe spaces where they can come to their faith communities and be open about their mental health issues and get support there. So we're right in the middle of running this randomized clustered trial on this. And the thing that I like the best about it is we're trying to then train parishioners to become NAMI facilitators so that each parish would have their own, you know, so it's like someone who knows both communities, right? Like they're the living embodiment of those two communities and they can help bridge those gaps.
That sounds like an amazing project. And I really love the point that you said that it has to be bi-directional, right? That, you know, organizations have to leverage each other's strengths and resources. And you're right. Oftentimes we come to faith-based leaders and communities to say, we need your help with this, but, and please refer patients back to us, but not the other way around, right? Saying you need to, you know, search out your faith-based leader, because part of, you know, care should be that is spiritual well-being as well, right?
Yes.
We include mental health, emotional, physical, but spiritual needs to be included as well. So thank you for adding that. Now I'm going to ask a question of the entire panel, and it's related to, you know, to what Dr. Wong was talking about right now. So how do culture and religion impact cancer diagnosis, treatment, and survivorship care? Anybody want to get started on that question?
I think we're all kind of waiting to jump in.
I just have a short, and again, more from the mental health ground, because that's my area. I would say it could be an incredible asset, like to help someone through recovery. But it could also be a barrier too, depending on where the faith community is with that particular health condition. And so if it's viewed as something that can be handled solely spiritually, then sometimes that can act as a barrier. But if they come alongside, it's like an invaluable resource that patients can have.
I think it's important to acknowledge that when a cancer patient is diagnosed and they hear those dreaded words, that it does create a battle, like inside. It's like a spiritual crisis, right? They're questioning their mortality. They're wondering, why me? You know, and often I don't ever really hear it being acknowledged as a spiritual crisis. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that happens. And I think by being able to share that multi-sector, like different, like on the faith-based side, on the mental health side, and say, hey, we have this population group that's dealing with a challenge here, then how can we work together? I think that'll reduce barriers too, and include more, or it'll promote more collaborative work in this space to address the spiritual crisis that a cancer warrior experiences.
Dr. Valle or Dr. Park, would you like to talk about how culture and religion can impact cancer care diagnosis and survivorship?
Yeah, I think, you know, just from my observations as a clinician, I think they're both, you know, as Dr. Wong was saying, immensely powerful in terms of dictating how a patient navigates their diagnosis and treatment. And to be honest, I don't interface or interact with that terribly much in the limited time we have in sort of the clinical setting. But when patients are very forthcoming and forthright and, you know, making their religion or sort of their cultural practices known to me, then I always try to use that, you know, in any way possible to help make their journey easier, whether it's sort of mutual reinforcement or, you know, communicating with other members of family, or, you know, connecting them with other people from a similar cultural background that I've treated previously. You know, kind of what we were talking about at the beginning. If it's important enough and the patient has made it clear that this is important to them, you have to meet them where they are, and you have to build that into their treatment regimen and sort of personalize it, because it can be an asset. It can only help if used in that way. So that's sort of been my experience with it.
Right. Even if, you know, as a clinician, I've seen kind of the two sides of the sword. As Dr. Wong mentioned, sometimes it can be very, very helpful. Sometimes it can, you know, provide some challenges. But I think it's important to, even when it does provide a challenge, you know, not to invalidate it or dismiss it, or, you know, kind of have an you know, opposing stance. You sometimes, if you just are honest about your feelings, and that your kind of lack of familiarity with this particular, you know, religion or particular set of beliefs that the patient has, and just frankly ask, you know, what do you need? How can I help you? And sometimes it's just time that they need. Sometimes they just need to sit with you. They need you to pray with them, and they need to ultimately come around in their own time. If there are community resources that you can identify and help connect, you know, the patient to, that would be great. But even if that's not possible, you know, we can't. The one thing certainly not to do is kind of disparage their beliefs and try to, you know, strong arm them into what you believe is the best course of, you know, treatment for the patient. It'll only backfire down the road.
Yeah, I do appreciate you saying that, you know, the importance of validation for folks. And then it also kind of leads to my next question, and I'm going to focus it with Dr. Valle and Dr. Park, but any of the panelists can answer it as well. But when we're talking about culture and religion, you know, how do we address the lack of racial and language concordance, concordant care between provider and patient? Because oftentimes when you're from that, you know, culture, from that background, speak that language or that religion, and I don't know if any of you are around to hear Shoshana's, you know, story about a hospital that, you know, was able to cater, you know, to her needs and how she felt valued and, you know, seen as a whole person because of it. So how do you think, what do we need to do to address that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's certainly a pipeline problem that's been well studied, and you know, I think as clinicians, we need to do everything we can to sort of circumvent the pipeline problem and proactively reach out into communities and recruit people from underrepresented backgrounds, not only to go into medicine, but to, you know, consider fields in oncology. You know, at UCLA, we've been trying to establish that through a fellowship program, which pays medical students potentially interested in radiation oncology. It gets them in the clinic, it connects them to a mentor, it gets them, you know, involved in research projects, and really shows them the impact that we have on cancer patients, which is a problem particularly for fields like ours, because we're, you know, third level referral specialty. So we're not very much on the forefront or on the front lines of cancer diagnosis and screening, for you know, better for worse. And this, you know, can impact just awareness of our field and what we have to offer to cancer patients. And so being proactive and recruiting, you know, medical students who are from underrepresented backgrounds is I think key to that. I was very excited to see that the Charles Drew School of Medicine is matriculating its first class. And so I think another component of this is just bringing medical training to the communities that you identify have challenges with health equity. And I think I'm very excited to see where that goes. And I think projects like that can only help. And then the language issue, that's something that can be learned. I know that UCLA periodically sends out emails for training courses for how to improve your medical Spanish. And even if it's a rudimentary understanding, when you're sitting down with the patient and they know that you're at least trying to meet them where they are. Again, this theme of meeting the patient where they are, you're trying to communicate with them on their level. Even if you do, require interpreter help for more nuanced levels of the discussion, I think is really powerful and sends a strong signal that we're aligned, we're on the same team. I'm ready to hear you and meet you where you are, I think are some potential strategies I've thought of to address this.
I completely agree. We definitely need a huge thing is representation. We need diverse representation in medicine. Practicing medicine isn't just about following guidelines. It's really in the delivery, and the people who are best able to deliver care to the underserved and underrepresented community are the people who are rooted in that community, who speak their language, who understand the culture, understand the challenges in the community that they're going through. So yes, recruitment and representation across the spectrum of healthcare service and delivery is something that needs to be stressed again and again. And then secondly, I think we need to be supportive of culturally competent providers, to be able to continue to practice in the community of need. If we can get motivated, skilled providers, they can do a huge amount of good. Even in a community setting, a lot of the time specialists are kind of specialists only in name. They're your therapist or your primary care doctor. They're your nutritionist and their wound care specialist. So it's I think it's really important to recruit committed talent and provide a structure where we can keep these talents in the communities without the significant systemic financial barriers and burnout from not having support. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park and Dr. Valle. We're having some really great questions coming in through the Q&A. One of them is, how do you mitigate the possibility of inequity that starts at the point of the patient being scheduled for a medical visit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is actually a really profound question, because there are all kinds of forces at play and barriers to sort of getting patients in for treatment, and a lot of them are sort of policy based, right? Some of them pertain to insurance networks, and so there are actually a significant hurdles to getting patients scheduled, at least in my clinic, and I'm sure for others as well. And this is something that I scratch my head about all the time. I don't have an answer. I think that, we're really good at controlling things sort of in our environment, but upstream of sort of the physician-patient interaction, speaking personally, that's not sort of an area of expertise that I have. I think clinicians seem to be actively engaged in these issues so that barriers are deconstructed upstream. But it's a really profound and really outstanding question that I'm hoping a lot of people are researching and hope to figure out a way to dismantle some of these upstream barriers.
Any of our other speakers want to contribute to that? How do we mitigate those inequities at the point of just getting patients in the door?
Yeah, I think I think this theme of meeting people where they're at, one of the reasons I was very interested in this line of work with faith-based communities is being in the places where people naturally have their social interactions, their community. So trying to make sure those information pipelines are there. But on the mental health side, one thing that I find helpful is the recent passage for funding for peer specialists in the mental health field. So I think it remains to be seen, but having these peer specialists who've gone through a very complicated healthcare system, and they're identifiable, right? Now, you know, these peer specialists have been trained, have gone through the whole system, and can actually walk side by side with someone through the process, to me might be a promising way to meet some of those disparities. And then also, if you can train bilingual peer specialists, that might help with some of the language issues too.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Wong. Now, this next one is a very interesting question. Here's a best case scenario. If you all had $1 million to spend on a program or interventions to get more patients from underserved communities into clinical trials, how would you spend it?
Again, another profound question. Dr. Park.
No, go ahead, Dr. Valle.
So I think a lot of the funding would probably be well spent on just sort of reducing barriers to like engaging with communities. A lot of these trials happen at like, you know, large academic centers that seem out of reach to a lot of communities who actually stand the most to benefit from these trials. And so I think, you know, just at UCLA, for example, we charge our patients to park, which is like crazy to me. And it seems to be like an insane barrier for any patient, but especially those who, you know, are coming from underserved backgrounds. And, you know, that's just small things like that could be like offset financially. I think doing that could potentially help. But, you know, getting people into the communities that, you know, we see as most disadvantaged, that we want to enroll on trials, and building those longitudinal relationships, that takes time, that takes money, that takes, you know, trusted champions, and it doesn't happen overnight. But I think that spending the money in that domain would probably pay long-term dividends.
I would love for there to be a team of community liaisons who can pool the available, you know, clinical trials and have, you know, they know exactly what's open, where, what the, you know, inclusion exclusion criterias are, and be able to help navigate the patients to get to, you know, get past that door. A lot of it right now in the community, at least, it really falls on the individual providers, especially for patients who have Medi-Cal. We're battling, and it's very time sensitive. Oftentimes when we're enrolling patients in clinical trial, patient has a very time sensitive diagnosis, you know, clinical trial versus, you know, standard of care. We need to get started on treatment one way or another. And usually insurance will only approve one consultation at a time. And even that you have to fight. And then sometimes, you know, if you put in 2 consultations simultaneously, they cancel each other out, and then like all the approvals get canceled. So it's a very delicate and very boring and tedious and frustrating experience. So you have like one shot at sending somebody to a clinical trial. So that means that the clinician has to look at all the available clinical trials in the community, see if and pre-screen the patient to see if they're eligible or not, usually do a lot of the legwork and specifically hand select certain trials that they really think might be the best thing for the patient, and really work at it to pave that pathway. And that's, you know, it can't all fall on the providers. And unfortunately, that's why, you know, enrolling referral for clinical trial enrollment is often not done or not done in a timely fashion. So I would love to have a team of clinical liaisons where I can identify patients who I want screened and to see if they're eligible for clinical trials, and then they can kind of do a lot of the background legwork to connect patients to the right providers, and that would be so good for the patients and the providers.
And I'm going to jump in and piggyback off Dr. Park's recommendation and shamelessly plug supporting grassroots organizations that are already doing amazing things, already are working with those population groups. Give them a much needed capacity building boost so that they can keep doing their work and they can be partners in getting more folks informed, educating them, and getting them into these trials.
Thank you. Great points, everybody. And I'd like to say, $1 million, but I think I'd spend it right away, right? It's not as much as you think it is when you're trying to reach population and cover all of those needs. But our next question is, do you have any thoughts on how we can better support the mental health of our patients and their families when there's such little time to address their needs?
I rely a lot on our, support staff and the nurse navigators. It's really important for the navigators and the nurses to, check in and, follow up with the patients. Oftentimes they have the best relationships and know all the going abouts about that, about the particular patient situation and family anyway. So even just a follow-up phone call, after the visit, just to say, hey, did the doctor address everything that needed to be addressed? Is there anything else that you're concerned about? And then, triaging and bringing those concerns back to the, to medical staff so we can appropriately, redirect those, patients' care has always been very helpful for me. But in the point of time care and during the appointment, I completely understand all the challenges of having to, address, a million different things.
And I wonder whether multi-sector partnerships would be helpful, like partnering with community organizations. NAMI, which is the community partner for my project, they have things like peer support groups, so people with lived experience, journeying along with other people who are in different journeys in their recovery, but then a family support group, because they recognize that the caregivers carry quite a lot of burden too, and they need support too in caring for their loved ones. So I think there can be already valuable resources in the community to lean on too.
Anybody else want to add to that? How we can better support the mental health needs of our patients if there's little time to address it?
I think you have to screen for it. You have to, if you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. And so it's almost like a fourth vital sign. Like how are you doing? How are you handling the diagnosis? What are your fears? Looking forward to like a 7-week course of radiation. Like you have to check in. You have to ask. Because if you don't ask, then you won't know.
Thank you.
And I think timing is super important too. When a patient is newly diagnosed, they're so overwhelmed and they're getting bombarded with all these appointments. And I always tell people, it's like you're in a whirlwind, you're in a tornado. And I don't like using the word journey so much because it doesn't feel like a vacation destination journey that you're headed to. It's a storm. So finding that right time, and it's very delicate. It's hard to even know when is the right time, but it's certainly not in the first couple appointments. Maybe it's a couple appointments in, like, how are you doing emotionally with this? And how can we best support you? And by the way, here's some resources like NAMI and some other organizations that you may want to connect with. And by the way, we have a peer mentor, so the timing I think is super important too.
Yeah. Thank you, Yoli. And that goes back to something that Dr. Wong said, right? That's why it's important to involve those with lived experience, right? Unless you've been a patient diagnosed with cancer, you wouldn't know about that timing. You'd think you want to give all the resources up front and prepare folks. And I know oftentimes in working with, our cancer patients, it was like, it's just too much. I feel like there's so much hand holding. And then towards the end, it's like, I'm just let go, but they give so much upfront and it's overwhelming, right? So that's why it's important, to engage those with lived experiences to give you that kind of feedback and information. Now, one more question that's also related to mental health. How can we improve mental health support for families that speak Spanish when we use iPads for interpretation? Language is so key when it comes to therapeutic intervention.
So the question being, like, using iPads specifically, how can we improve mental health support using that particular tool for Spanish-speaking patients?
Yeah,
I think
they're
it's more
asking
the
that.
depersonalization of having to go, you look at an interpreter on iPad, during appointments. Yeah.
That's how I read it too, Dr. Park. Like, we're using iPads
But
for
correct me if I'm wrong.
interpretation. Yeah, I read it the same way, but you can interpret it any way you want. And I don't know if the person who asked the question wants to elaborate, but I'm assuming they also said that, when we're using these iPads for interpretation, that maybe that can be a barrier unto itself. And so how do we improve mental health support for those families that speak Spanish?
I think if a facility has a significant Spanish-speaking population, it really behooves them to make the appropriate hiring. I mean, even an in-person translator, even if it's not a medical staff in clinic, it does make a huge difference to have an in-person translator available at the time of the appointment versus a virtual one over the phone or on video.
And I think about the pipeline issue that Dr. Valle brought up before, and there were lots of funding outside of the U.S. to developing countries to really see if they could train non-mental health professionals to deliver certain types of brief interventions, and that's been found to be pretty successful. And so, in my mind, just like I think Dr. Valle was saying, in our own backyard, we have these major disparities compared to, countries abroad. And I think that could be a way to really increase the workforce, with culturally diverse populations and with lingual capacities, is to task shift and be able to train non-mental health professionals to deliver maybe briefer intervention, so that you don't have to get, a PhD or a master's to be providing mental health services. It could be a much faster pipeline to that.
Well, I think, is there anything the panel wants to add before we end our panel this afternoon? Any last burning comments?
I just want to, there was just one more question that came up that's still open. And I know that was a follow-up question, I think, to the initial question, the Q&A question that we had. And I thought that might be worthwhile to just address if the panel had thoughts on it. I think the way that I interpreted it is just, again, barriers to that initial consultation. And actually, until maybe a few months ago, I wasn't aware of exactly what kind of that initial email and introduction our patients get. And I looked at the list, and it's an overwhelming list of tasks. Like, you have to get this imaging, you have to get this CD, you need to request this pathology, you need to fill out this pack, and you need to bring this XYZ. And I said, this is way too much. Patients have just heard that they have a cancer diagnosis or potentially, a major serious life-threatening condition. They can't, run around all over town, collecting all these information, delaying their care. Some of the systemic challenges, such as, insurance, is sometimes difficult to overcome. But beyond that, if they have been referred to see me, to get them through the door. Whatever else is necessary, we'll do the legwork. We'll figure out what's priority, what's actually absolutely necessary, just to have a laundry list of things that the patients need to accomplish to do their homework. To see a specialist provider is unrealistic. So, we need to be mindful of these things, and, these are simple things to eliminate.
Yeah, I agree. Sort of in my practice, just last week, I was like, there's a patient who didn't have any of their images. It's like, doesn't matter, get them in clinic first.
Mhm.
And then once I see them, then I can sort of deploy all of the support staff at our clinic to help the patient acquire these images, track them down. And so, yeah, I think that's certainly one approach, is, liberalizing a lot of the requirements before a consultation can take place.
As a patient, I can really appreciate that. And I'm not in a clinical setting. We're in a community-based organization setting. So I make it a point to share with my clients that my experiences in being able to get in the door, and teaching them how to advocate for themselves, and encouraging them to advocate for themselves, and giving them the courage to advocate for themselves, and telling them it's okay to advocate for themselves, and how. Say, be that squeaky wheel. Let's make a phone call together. Let's call them every day until we can get in. And I think that this is more of a shared responsibility, that we as patients, or potential patients, future patients, don't stop at no, and keep trying.
Dr. Wong, would you like to contribute?
I agree. I think again, I go back to the policies, right? Like the system, the policies, the funding, they're not built around understanding the needs of the patients to facilitate these kinds of support things. And so I think if we can change the policies so that this becomes the standard of care, that's how we're going to solve a lot of these inequities.
Thank you, Dr. Wong. Thank you, everyone. And it absolutely, if some of the issues are stemming from, there's systemic barriers, and then sometimes the only way to impact those is through policy and changing those policies and those guidelines so that we don't have those barriers for our patients who need that the most. But I really want to thank Dr. Valle, Dr. Park, Dr. Wong, and Yoli for serving on our panel today. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. A lot of great conversation here about how we can address health inequities in cancer care. So for now, we're going to be taking a short break. Our next presentation will be